2022 has been a standout year for PC gaming and technology. Not only have there been some incredible software releases, but we've seen some awesome hardware releases too from Nvidia, AMD and of course Intel. With the RTX 40 series really actually outdoing, I think, many expectations. The RDNA 3 series from AMD launching in just a couple of days and looking extremely promising. And on the CPU side of things, Raptor Lake and also Zen 4 have been very interesting indeed. And also, Arc from Intel is looking better and better with some software and driver updates. It's still very early days to see where Intel go from here, but with any luck we will see a decent third competitor in the market. But as the title of this video implies, we're going to be discussing some very intriguing rumors concerning AMD and their next generation of products. The march of technology never stops, and as you can imagine, they're already working on some very interesting updates to their latest and greatest architectures, and we're going to get right into it after this message from the video's sponsor.
PUBG is a game that needs no introduction, and PUBG Mobile is one of the most popular battle royale games worldwide with over 50 million active daily players. You can play solo with friends in one of 10 game modes across 6 different maps. Footballer Lionel Messi has joined forces with PUBG for a special time-limited event. Lionel Messi is one of the best Argentinian players since Maradona and was unbelievably good for Barcelona and led them to many successes. Accomplish the weekly Messi activities, unlock a wide array of Messi content for free, including Messi's golden shoes which give you a sprint and boost effects, and let your character do a football dribble movement. Plus, alongside this there will be a lot of Messi customized items such as Messi skins, Messi weapons, a Messi bag and bag ornaments, Messi parachutes, a Messi plane and more. Another exciting update coming soon to PUBG is the Global Chicken Cup with a lot of football themed content. This includes a football themed park on the Arangel map, a football car, a new single player vehicle, a carnival football field on Arangel and Livik, and lots more. Simply click the link in our description to download the game and get right into the action.
I want to start things out with AMD CPU lineup because things have been getting very interesting since the launch of Ryzen 7000. In fact, things were quite intriguing since the launch of Intel's Alder Lake. Raptor Lake has been very competitive with Zen 4, but I suspect that the performance crown will be AMD's once again once the Vcache Zen 4's launch. I don't want to spend too long on Vcache because I've already covered it so much as well as others, but basically we're looking at 8, 12 and 16 cores seemingly confirmed to receive Vcache variants. 6 cores potentially receives it, but I personally find it unlikely based on what sources are telling me, and also it just doesn't really seem like it would be something AMD would do, but who knows, maybe I'm wrong. Clock frequencies for Zen 4D are closer to vanilla counterparts, so this is unlike Zen 3D where there was a difference in clock frequency between the 5800X3D and the vanilla parts. Speaking of which, performance is actually kind of similar to what we saw previously with Zen 3 versus Zen 3D. I'm hearing around 20 to 30% on average, but it's going to be application and SKU dependent. So obviously some applications just benefit more from the cache than others, and well, if you have a higher core count part, then things obviously change anyway because you've got more Vcache, for example. There's also a higher TDP. Likely 170 watts for the higher core count, so that's 12 and 16, but I'm not certain about that 8, so I don't know if it's lower. The announcement is probably set for CES as a certainty. One source has told me that the 16 cores are coming out later though, potentially by a couple of months, but there's a lot of confusion as to release date. Some people online are stating that the CPUs are going to be available at some point in January, while others are saying it's going to be later. I've personally heard from one source that it's going to be earlier for the lower end cores, for the lower end core counts, but later for the higher end core counts. Who knows? It's going to be an interesting one, and also what the product availability and pricing is going to be like. But let's shift to Zen 5. I find it a lot more interesting as there's been a lot of conflicting information concerning Zen 5, but what is pretty certain at this stage is that Zen 5 is a much bigger shift in design goals versus Zen 4. So Zen 5 is much more of a revolution versus the evolution that was Zen 4. So Zen 4 is a very impressive architecture, and there were numerous changes, for example cache tweaks, a lot more bandwidth, and well, AMD rather amusingly did implement AVX 512 pretty effectively in its desktop iteration. And this is kind of something that Intel didn't do so well, but ultimately the biggest change wasn't the IPC gains. They were really coming from the clock frequency in terms of the performance. So Zen 5 then changes things significantly, focusing on IPC, reducing intercore latencies, and generally just tightening up the weaknesses of the Zen architecture. We've already seen some official disclosures about this thanks to when AMD announced Zen 4, but the architecture is basically confirmed to launch in 2024. That's not too surprising given the general release schedule for Ryzen CPUs, and it's sporting a ground-up design, so it says AMD. Naturally, we've seen mention of improved performance and efficiency, the latter being something AMD push heavily as a company ethos, particularly in data center, but also for mobile as well. A big key to this achievement is a radical shift in the front-end pipeline and instruction issue, says AMD. They also make no secret in their desire to integrate AI and ML. I won't mention too much about this right now because, well, there's been some hints of it already for AMD's direction with APUs. And given the fact that I've also heard that there's additional instructions for the Ryzen CPUs, possibly for ML/NPU, I'll get more into that in a second, it's a little more confusing because I do suspect some of these implementations will not be for the desktop, which is where I've got most of my information. So let's get into Granite Ridge, shall we? So Granite Ridge, or potentially Ryzen 8000, whatever you want to call it. That's assuming Ryzen 8000 is the name they go with. Maybe they'll call it Ryzen 9000 or whatever if there's a refresh. There's going to be significant performance gains, 20 to 30% over Zen 4. This is an average across different workloads. Clocks remain quite close to Zen 4. I think it's way too early though to know exactly what the clock frequency is going to be. So I've heard that they're going to be a little higher than Zen 4, but not hugely higher. It's not going to be the same leap that we saw from Zen 3 to Zen 4, let me put it that way. So as far as I understand it, CPU core counts per CCX is remaining at 8. Previously, if you've watched my older video, you'll notice that I'd said it was double, but I don't think this is true. I've heard that AMD did definitely experiment internally, and that's possibly where I received that previous information based upon, but I do not think this is true anymore. I've heard from a couple of really good sources that it's almost certainly remaining as 8 cores per CCX. I would love for it to not be. I would love for my older info of 16 cores to be accurate, because I just think it would be kind of cool to see, but I do not think it's true. Furthermore, the big .little design for Zen 4 is also not part of desktop SKUs, so we're only going to see the big cores, which of course are based on Zen 5. As AMD have already mentioned officially, front-end instruction issues have got an overhaul. For a couple of small updates for this, but nothing super specific at the moment. It seems that there are some changes to the decoders. They seem to be wider. Zen 4 uses a 4 wide, which is a little bit at odds with the 10 wide execution units. So I'm assuming we're going to see those get beefed up. There's also seems to be increases in load/store bandwidth, although I'm less certain about that. There seems to be some general improvements to the logic units, but I don't have specifics at the moment. There's also new instructions. I think these are for ML/NPU. I've got low confidence on this. I don't know which is specifically for Granite Ridge and which are for, let's say, mobile or what have you. L1 caches have seen a pretty big change. They are larger. L2 cache is now unified across the CCX. I also feel it's larger as well. So per CCX for the 7950X, you have 8 megabytes of L2 cache, but obviously each core has its own private 1 megabyte. So 8 cores times 1, obviously 8 megabytes total. So I think the L2 cache is larger, but it's shared across all of those cores. L3 cache, though, is more like infinity cache, from what I'm hearing, with separate chips rather than clusters on the CCX itself. This means, of course, multiple CCXs can basically access the L3 cache. Core counts for Granite Ridge remain 16, more on that in a second. TSMC 3 and 4nm are possibly being leveraged, with 4nm for the desktop and 3nm for mobile and probably servers. I'm not 100% on this one, honestly. I'm quite low confident on that right now. But let's examine these points more closely. There's a lot of stuff to get through here. But the caches and intercore latencies are very curious. If my information is accurate, and obviously you should take this with a huge dose of salt, because honestly, even if Lisa Su herself told me this information and she leaked it to me, plans can change before launch. And we're at the point now in technology where stuff gets cancelled quite literally, you know, a couple of weeks before it's announced, or something is announced, but it's basically just available, you know, in super limited quantities. So it's not even, you know, it's not even paper launch. It's like tissue paper launch at this stage. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. But for a brief kind of overview of how L2 works, you can basically think of it as L3 for Zen 4, but there are going to be massive latency reductions. So intercore latency and cache latency doesn't sound like a big deal. You can think, well, it's just a couple of nanoseconds here or a couple of nanoseconds there. What does it matter? But remember, you're dealing with thousands of instructions across multiple cores per frame. If, for example, you're dealing with games. And this can be a really big deal. So this becomes an even bigger deal, of course, if you're dealing with cache misses or missed branch predictions and so on and so on. So it can really affect frame rates in games, trips to RAM, and so on and so on. Now, L3 seems to act more like infinity cache, and as I mentioned a moment ago, it can be addressed easily across multiple CCXs. I assume the cache, therefore, is either a single chiplet or multiple chiplets, but I don't know how L3 works. But a chiplet-based L3 makes kind of sense given RDNA 3 and how they've moved their infinity cache structure. Also, remember that AMD have already hinted that there's going to be V-cache variants for Zen 5, basically the whole gamut. So my theory is that, well, they can basically do the same thing here. They can just plonk on extra, you know, V-cache very easily. There's also another possibility, though, that I did want to let you guys know. So I've had two sources that basically gave me this information. The first source specifically stated it was L3, but the other one simply said LLC. So potentially this is not L3, but instead an L4 cache, which could make sense given the implementations of Zen 5. We'll also see lower end Zen 4 cores, or Zen 4C should I say, being set along Zen 5. This is speculation on my part. For now, I'm going to say that it's that it's L3, and we'll see how it goes. But what is quite curious to me is core counts. So I think they are remaining at 16. Previously, I'd stated up to 32, but I do not think this is true. I think instead, AMD are going to continue to push 16 cores. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. There's technical issues that I've been told about, but I also think that there's just no reason for them to do it yet. Potentially Zen 6 or something like that, we can see it, but I don't think AMD are going to do it right now. And one of the big ways you can kind of gather that they won't is just by looking at what Intel are doing. So Intel's Arrow Lake, for example, has 8 performance cores, their Lion Cove, and 16 Skymont, those are the energy efficient cores. This has been essentially semi-officially confirmed by Intel in a slide. Meteor Lake sports even fewer cores, 6/16, with Redwood being the performance core, and Crestmont being the energy efficient ones. Therefore, I'm much more confident in saying that AMD will stick to 16 cores, focusing on tightening up both the perf thread performance and also multi-threading performance. Now let's shift to RDNA 4. Just like Zen 5, a lot of this information is pretty preliminary, so I have a lot of murky details for RDNA 4, but you can basically think of this architecture as quite similar to RDNA 3. In fact, another way to think of this is more like Zen 3 to Zen 4. There are a plethora of improvements, but as many of you know, one of the big changes for RDNA 3 was the GCD/MCD design. The GCD is relatively cheap for AMD to produce, even on 5nm, and honestly, if you think about it from a logical perspective, the chiplet approach actually provides a ton of flexibility and also production cost advantages. But it also means that AMD can simply scale the GCD to be bigger and put more compute out. hypothetically, AMD could increase the GCD by 50% and gain a huge amount of additional ALU and RT performance, because a lot of the stuff inside the die remains relatively stagnant in how much space it requires to do the job, such as, say, display engines and media engines. Now, this is, of course, assuming there are multiple things to support that. For example, whether the GPU scheduler is capable of handling it, and if the GPU itself doesn't require too much juice to run. Obviously, if it's like 900 watts being pushed through the GCD, that could be a bit of a problem. And you'll also, of course, need enough bandwidth to feed the beast, either with caches or memory itself, like GDDR6 or whatever. But AMD, in theory anyway, could hypothetically just add in a bunch of extra shaders. But you also need to keep those shaders busy, so just raising ALUs by, say, 50% doesn't necessarily equate to 50% extra performance, but that's a bit outside of the scope of this video. With that said, I do have a few early RDNA 4 bits of information. So I've heard again AMD are doubling performance over RDNA 3. This seems to be AMD's established pattern. So RDNA 1 to 2 to 2 to 3, roughly speaking, if you look at their flagships for each of those parts, it roughly doubled the performance. Speaking of performance per watt also sees a gain. I've been told 50% improved, with a low up to 60%. GDDR7 is used on N41 and 42. This is pretty obvious given the architecture launches in 2024 and GDDR7 from Samsung is ready in 2023. It will continue to be a single GCD. There is no multi-GCD design, at least for gaming, potentially for prosumer work or whatever, but for gaming it is going to remain a single GCD. Clock frequency gains. Well, yeah, there's been a lot of rumours RDNA 3 missed clock frequency targets. Whether they're true or not, I've been told RDNA 4 ramps up clocks significantly over N31. Caches also see a larger bump as well, with one of the big changes being L2. I've got lower confidence on this one though. 32GB of GDDR7 RAM. This would indicate a 256-bit bus, which would be a 1.15 terabytes per second of bandwidth, assuming 36 Gbps modules were used. So that's compared to 960 gigabytes per second of the 7900 XTX. This is potentially possible with cache improvements, data compressions, infinity cache changes, and so on and so on. But honestly, I've low confidence in this right now. But if the above is true, it would also indicate that there are significant changes to the MCDs. They would need to be larger, because obviously infinity cache would naturally need to be bigger. And you would also assume that there's only going to be 4 of them. So it's going to be interesting, assuming they still act as the memory controllers as well. This is not particularly that interesting, but it's also likely to be PCIe 5.0, as PCIe 6 probably isn't going to be ready in time. So there you go, guys. Hopefully you have enjoyed the video. As you can see, the setup is still really higgledy-piggledy. I've moved to yet another room, so longer term, this is going to be the office, hopefully. And there is a lot of stuff that needs to be done, including obviously replacing what is essentially a dining table at the moment. I'm using as a, well, table for the computer. Literally at this point there are like things that are like not actually physically on the desk properly. I don't know if you can see, but I probably can't actually, but the one of the legs on the monitor back there is basically resting on like an empty box. I think it's like an RTX 3080 box or something like that. So obviously that's pretty important to remedy. So that's why, content has been a little bit less recently, just because trying to organize things, there will be a really big change in the office, and we're going to be doing some other really cool stuff as well, changing the lighting setup and stuff like that. But obviously a lot of the stuff takes time, because also I'm moving at the same time as that and trying to organize a bunch of other crap. Christmas time is also coming up, which makes things a little interesting, trying to organize things around friends and family. With that said, if you guys have any really good tips or videos for like making really big desks, one of the things I was considering is something like an IKEA desk, the kitchen counters or something like that. I've seen some interesting guides for that. I'm not a huge DIY person. but you know, I can do the basics. So let me know if you have like some ideas of that, especially if you want to, you can message me on Twitter, that would be awesome, or you can also email me, paul@redgamingtech.com, if you've got some ideas or you've done kind of similar setups or anything like that. Do let me know, because I've got to admit, DIY is a bit of a weak point, so if you can point me in some directions, that would be absolutely amazing, and I would love you forever and ever and ever. And yeah, I think that's just about it for now. Hopefully you have, as I said, enjoyed the video. Stay safe, guys. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.